The first time Mamie Merriweather was put back on a train, she was still holding the letter that had promised her a husband, a home, and a future, and she watched through the dusty window as Caldwell, Kansas, shrank into nothing behind her. She had arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, wearing her best dress, the blue wool one with the ivory buttons her mother had sewn on the night before Mamie left Missouri. She had a carpetbag in one hand and a letter in the other, and the letter was signed by a man named Clarence Hooper, who had advertised in the St. Louis Dispatch for a bride of good character and reasonable disposition. Mamie was 23 years old. She had good character in abundance and a disposition that could charitably be called spirited. She had answered the advertisement because there was nothing left for her in Hannibal, Missouri. Her parents were both gone, her father to a fever and her mother to a slow grief that followed the fever like a shadow, and because she had always believed, with the kind of stubborn faith that either saves a person or destroys them entirely, that there was something better waiting for her somewhere if she was only willing to move toward it. Clarence Hooper met her at the station. He was a round man with small eyes and a mustache that looked like it belonged on someone else's face, and when he saw Mamie step off the train with her carpetbag and her hopeful expression, something shifted in his face that she did not immediately understand. "Miss Merriweather," he said, and he did not offer his hand. "Mr. Hooper," she said, "it is a pleasure to finally meet you." He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the train, then looked back at her. "I was expecting someone," he said slowly, "more along the lines of what was described to me." Mamie was quiet for a moment. "I described myself honestly in my letters," she said. "I am 5 feet and 4 inches. I have brown hair and green eyes. I told you I was not a delicate woman." "You did not tell me," Hooper said, "that you were quite so opinionated in your bearing." She had not said a single word to this man beyond a greeting and a statement of fact. She understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that Clarence Hooper had wanted a woman who would look at him like he was the sun itself and feel grateful for the warmth. Mamie had never looked at anyone that way in her life. She had looked at people honestly and directly, and the men who could not tolerate that had always found a reason to send her away. Hooper paid her return fare to the next station along the line, which was a town called Pratt, where he had apparently already made arrangements with another advertisementancer situation. He apologized without looking ashamed, which was worse than no apology at all. Mamie sat back on the train with her carpetbag on her lap and her hands folded, and her jaw set in a line that she knew would give her a headache by evening. She was not going to cry. She had decided years ago that she would cry only when something was worth crying about, and Clarence Hooper was not worth a single tear. She arrived in Pratt on a Wednesday afternoon, and a man named Gordon Fitch was waiting for her there. Gordon Fitch was a farmer with a face like a boot and the personality to match. He had written to the same Missouri newspaper agency that matched correspondence with potential brides, and his letters had been perfectly adequate. Not warm, not funny, but adequate. Mamie had told herself that adequate was a reasonable beginning. She had been wrong. Gordon Fitch shook her hand and walked her to his wagon without saying anything that could be called conversation. He showed her the farm, which was real and functional. He showed her the house, which was clean enough. He showed her where the church was on Sunday mornings and where the general store was, and where she would plant the kitchen garden if she decided to stay. The word "if" arrived in the sentence without warning, and Mamie latched onto it. "You said if," she pointed out. "I said it," Fitch agreed. "Is there a question in your mind about whether I would stay?" she asked. He studied her with the same expression he probably used when evaluating whether a particular field was worth the trouble of plowing. "You are more forward than I anticipated," he said. "I am direct," Mamie said. "There is a difference." He did not seem to think there was a difference, and he spent the next 2 days communicating primarily in grunts and meaningful silences, until Mamie finally sat down at his kitchen table and said, with more patience than she actually felt, "Mr. Fitch, I think we should speak honestly about whether this arrangement suits us." Gordon Fitch told her honestly that he had hoped for a quieter woman, and that he was not sure he could accommodate a woman who asked as many questions as Mamie did. Mamie told him honestly that she was not capable of becoming someone who asked fewer questions, and that she thought they would make each other miserable inside of a year. They shook hands with a respect that was almost friendly, and Fitch paid her fare to the next town, which was a place called Dodge City, because it was the closest stop on the line and because he thought, he said, that a woman like her might find it more to her liking. Mamie was not sure if that was a compliment or not. Dodge City in 1882 was still carrying the reputation of a cattle town, still smelling of livestock and leather, and the particular dusty wind that came off the plains like it had been traveling a long time to get there. Mamie arrived on a Friday evening when the light was golden and slanted and made everything look more dramatic than it probably was. The man she was supposed to meet in Dodge City was named Bert Sallies, and Bert Sallies was already at the saloon when she arrived, which was something she discovered by asking the station master where she might find him. The station master looked at her with something between sympathy and amusement. "Ma'am," he said, "Bert Sallies has been at the Long Branch since noon." Mamie walked to the Long Branch saloon and stood in the doorway because she was not the kind of woman who simply walked into saloons without a moment's consideration. She had a moment's consideration. Then she walked in. Bert Sallies was not a bad man, she decided, watching him from across the room. He was just not a present one. He existed somewhere inside himself where whiskey had made the walls comfortable, and when his eyes finally found her in the doorway of the Long Branch, there was a second where something looked almost like recognition, almost like the man who had written those letters, and then it was gone. "Miss Merriweather," he said, raising his glass. "You look just like I hoped." "Thank you," she said. "Are you often here at this hour?" "Most hours," he said cheerfully. She sat down across from him anyway, because she was not a woman who made decisions without all available information, and they talked for 2 hours. She learned that his farm had failed 2 seasons ago and he had not tried to revive it. She learned that he was lonely in a way that had calcified into habit. She learned that he was kind in his heart but unreachable in his daily life, and that he was looking for someone to fill a shape in his life without requiring him to do anything differently to accommodate her. "I think," she said finally, "that you need something I am not able to give you." "What's that?" Bert asked. "Someone who will not notice," she said gently. He looked at her for a long time and then he laughed, and the laugh was real, and it was maybe the saddest thing she had encountered on this entire journey. He paid for her supper and arranged for her ticket to the next town on the line, and he did it without argument because he was not a man who argued. He was a man who let things happen to him. Mamie shook his hand and wished him genuinely well. She was put back on the train for the 3rd time on a Friday night, with $23 in her purse and a carpetbag that was getting heavier in her arms if not in its actual contents, and she sat in the dark of the passenger car and watched the prairie slide past the window and allowed herself, for the first time, to think clearly about what was happening to her. She was being sent back. Again and again, she was being put on trains by men who had wanted the idea of her but not the reality, and the reality was simply that Mamie Merriweather was a whole person with opinions and a direct gaze, and a refusal to make herself smaller so that a man could feel larger beside her. She was not unreasonable. She was not unkind. She simply existed at full size, and apparently that had been too much for 3 towns running. The train moved through the night, and Mamie sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the black prairie and at the stars that were enormous out here, more numerous and brighter than anything she had seen in Missouri, and she made herself a promise. She was going to the next town on the line, wherever it stopped, and if the man there sent her back too, she was going to get off the train at the very next stop after that, and she was going to plant herself somewhere new and make her own life and stop waiting for someone else to decide whether she was worth keeping. The train reached the town of Harlan's Creek, Texas, at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in April of 1882. Mamie had not expected Harlan's Creek. No one had arranged for a man to meet her there. There had been no advertisement, no letter, no correspondence. She had simply landed there because the train had stopped and she had decided to get off, as she had promised herself she would, and the platform was wooden and warped, and there was a stray dog sleeping in a patch of sunlight at the far end, and the morning air smelled like sage and coffee and something like cedar. And for reasons she could not entirely explain, Mamie Merriweather picked up her carpetbag and stepped off the train. The conductor called after her, "Ma'am, this train goes to Amarillo." "I know," she said. "Thank you for the ride." She stood on the platform until the train pulled away, the dog lifting its head briefly at the sound and then settling back into its patch of sun. The station master appeared in the doorway of a small wooden building with a coffee mug in his hand and an expression of considerable curiosity. "Morning," he said. "You looking for someone?" "Not particularly," Mamie said. "Is there a boarding house in this town?" He blinked. "There's Mrs. Caldwell's place on the north end. She takes in travelers." "Thank you," Mamie said, and she walked off the platform toward the main street of Harlan's Creek, Texas, with her carpetbag in her hand and no plan beyond finding a room and a cup of coffee and perhaps the shape of what came next. Harlan's Creek had one main street, which was unpaved and wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without incident. There was a general store, a church, a livery stable, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel that looked like it had been built by someone who had seen a larger hotel once and done their best, a barber shop, and a saloon that was quieter than the Long Branch and had a hand-painted sign that said simply Reed's. There were houses on the streets that spread off the main one like branches, modest and functional, with kitchen gardens beginning to go green in the April warmth. It was not a grand town. It was not even a particularly prosperous-looking one. But it was real, and it was alive, and as Mamie walked down the main street toward what she hoped was the north end, she had the strange and specific feeling of a person who has found the right place without having known they were looking for it. She nearly walked directly into Alfred Rourke. He came around the corner of the blacksmith's shop with a piece of iron in one hand and a distracted expression on his face, and Mamie sidestepped just in time to avoid a collision, and they both stopped and looked at each other. Alfred Rourke was tall, though not extravagantly so, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any ambition toward it. He had dark hair that was somewhat in need of cutting, and brown eyes that were, Mamie noticed immediately, paying genuine attention to her in a way that none of the men on her journey had managed quite so quickly or so naturally. He was wearing a leather apron over a work shirt, and he had iron dust on his forearms and a smudge across one cheekbone that he was clearly unaware of. She placed him at around 28 or 29 years old. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, with a cadence that was unhurried without being slow. "I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I entirely," Mamie said, which was honest. She had been looking at the buildings, cataloging the town. He looked at the carpetbag. "You just come in on the morning train." "I did." "You meeting someone here?" "No," she said. "I am looking for Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house." He pointed north without hesitation. "Third house past the church. She keeps a sign out front. Breakfast is included in the rate and it is the best breakfast in the county." "Thank you," Mamie said. He nodded and moved to let her pass, and she moved to pass him, and they went their separate ways on the main street of Harlan's Creek, Texas, on a Saturday morning in April. Mamie found Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house and negotiated a rate for a week, which was all she could reasonably afford, and she washed the train dust off her face and hands and sat at the breakfast table where Mrs. Caldwell, who was a broad and practical woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and the eyes of someone who had seen considerable nonsense in her time, put coffee and eggs and biscuits in front of her without asking whether she was hungry. "You are hungry," Mrs. Caldwell said, which was a statement and not a question. "I am," Mamie agreed. "Traveling far." "From Missouri," Mamie said. "More recently from Dodge City." Mrs. Caldwell sat down across from her with her own coffee and looked at her with that clear-eyed assessment that Mamie was beginning to recognize as the look of competent women everywhere. On your own. Yes. By choice, Mamie paused. By necessity that has become a choice, she said. Mrs. Caldwell nodded as if this made complete sense. What are you going to do in Harlan's Creek? I am not entirely sure yet, Mamie said. I can cook and sew and keep accounts. I was a school teacher for 2 years before I left Missouri. Is there a school here? Mrs. Caldwell looked at her with a new kind of interest. The schoolhouse has been without a teacher since January, she said. Mr. Hartley, who ran the school, moved to San Antonio for his health. The town council has been trying to find a replacement. Mamie drank her coffee and looked out the window at the April morning. Who is on the town council? She asked. She met with the town council that same afternoon, which consisted of 3 men. The general store owner, whose name was Patterson, a rancher named Delacroix who had ridden in from his spread east of town, and the mayor, who was a slight man named Abel who wore a coat that was slightly too large for him and compensated for this by speaking with great emphasis. They asked her questions about her schooling, her experience, her reasons for being in Harlan's Creek, and whether she intended to stay. She told them about her 2 years teaching in Hannibal. She told them she had experience with students ranging from 6 to 16. She did not tell them about the 3 towns and the 3 men who had sent her back, because that was not relevant to her qualifications, and because she owed these men no explanation of her private life. You intend to stay? Mayor Abel asked again, which was when she realized this was the real question, the one underneath all the others. Yes, she said, and she meant it. They gave her the position on a 2-month trial, which she accepted without complaint. She was to begin the following Monday. The schoolhouse had been closed for 3 months and would need cleaning and organizing, and the council would see to it that firewood was available, and her salary would be modest but sufficient, especially with the boarding house rate she had negotiated with Mrs. Caldwell. She walked home from the meeting in the afternoon sun and felt, for the first time since leaving Missouri, that she was standing on solid ground. She saw Alfred Rourke again on Sunday morning outside the church. He had cleaned up from the blacksmith's shop, no iron dust, no leather apron, and he was wearing a dark coat that was not new but was cared for, and his hair had been neatly combed though it still wanted cutting. He was talking to a man Mamie didn't recognize, but he noticed her arrival at the church steps and nodded, and she nodded back and went inside. The congregation of Harlan's Creek was smaller than she had grown up with in Missouri, but the service had the same quality of genuine rather than performed faith that she had always preferred, and the minister, Reverend Gaines, gave a sermon about the mercy of new beginnings that seemed, under the circumstances, directed specifically at Mamie, even though she knew it was not. After the service, in the yard outside the church where people gathered and the April sun was warm and pleasant, Mrs. Caldwell appeared at Mamie's elbow and began introducing her to people with the efficiency of someone who has decided that you belong somewhere and intends to install you properly. Mrs. Caldwell introduced her to the blacksmith, whose name, it turned out, was Patrick Rourke, and who was Alfred's uncle and nothing at all like Alfred in appearance, short and red-faced and loud with laughter. Patrick Rourke shook her hand with a grip that could have bent iron and said that he had heard she was the new school teacher, and that this was the best news Harlan's Creek had received since the general store started stocking decent coffee. Alfred Rourke appeared beside his uncle with 2 cups of the church's considerably less decent coffee and offered one to Mamie before he seemed to fully realize he was doing it, and then he seemed to consider taking it back, and then he did not take it back, and Mamie accepted it. "Thank you," she said. "You are the new teacher," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she said. "Did news travel that fast?" "In Harlan's Creek," he said, "news travels at whatever speed Mrs. Caldwell sets." Mrs. Caldwell, who was within earshot, made a sound that was not quite a denial. "What kind of iron work do you do?" Mamie asked, because she had seen the variety of iron things hanging in and around the blacksmith shop when she had nearly collided with him the day before. He looked at her with what she was beginning to identify as his characteristic attention. "Mostly practical things," he said. "Horseshoes, tools, hardware for wagons and buildings. Sometimes gates. Sometimes decorative work when someone asks for it." He paused. "I like the decorative work better, but it pays less, so I keep the proportions sensible." "That is a very honest answer," she said. "Is there a reason to be dishonest about it?" he said, and there was nothing aggressive in the question, only a genuine curiosity. "None," she said. "I appreciate it." They drank their indifferent coffee in the April sunshine, and Patrick Rourke talked about the new ranch fence someone had commissioned and the weather and the prospects for the season, and Mamie listened and asked questions and felt, in some quiet and unannounced corner of herself, that she was in the right place. She began her teaching on Monday. The schoolhouse was a single room with 9 long unused desks, and a blackboard that had gone chalky and dim, and windows that let in good light once she had opened them and beaten the dust out of the curtains. She had spent Sunday afternoon cleaning, and by the time she was done, the schoolhouse smelled of soap and chalk, and the particular clean scent of a room that has been restored to its purpose. 11 children arrived on Monday morning, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were the mixed collection that frontier schools always were, some eager, some wary, some trailing the particular quiet of children who had learned not to expect very much. Mamie had always been good with children in the specific way of a person who takes them seriously, who does not speak to them in a higher register or simplify the world on their behalf, but who instead presents reality to them at a manageable pace and with genuine respect. By midday, she had won 3 of them entirely and made progress with 5 more, and the remaining 3 were waiting to see what she did next, which was a perfectly reasonable position and one she respected. By the end of the week, she had 11 students who came willingly, which she considered a success. Alfred Rourke's shop was 6 buildings down from the schoolhouse, close enough that she passed it twice a day on her way to and from Mrs. Caldwell's, and she began to notice, as weeks passed, that there was often a moment in the morning and a moment in the evening when he would look up from whatever he was doing at the anvil or in the doorway, and she would be walking past, and they would exchange a nod or a word. It began as the nod and became a word, and then became 2 words and then became, by the 3rd week of April, an actual conversation that lasted 10 or 12 minutes while she stood on the packed dirt in front of his shop, and he leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded, and they talked about things that were sometimes practical and sometimes not. He asked her once what had brought her to Harlan's Creek specifically, and she told him about the train, and she was honest about it because she had decided at Mrs. Caldwell's breakfast table on her first morning that she was done being anything less than honest about who she was and how she had arrived. "I was a mail-order bride arrangement," she said, not flinching from the term. 3 times, 3 different men in 3 different towns who found me unsuitable when they met me in person. Alfred Rourke looked at her steadily from the doorframe. He did not look uncomfortable or pitying or amused, which were the 3 responses she had feared. "What did they find unsuitable?" he asked. "My directness primarily," she said. "I ask questions, I have opinions, I look at people directly. I am told these qualities are a great deal to manage." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems like a problem with the men," he said. She looked at him. "Most people would say it is a problem with me." "Most people would be wrong," he said simply, and went back to whatever he had been doing at the anvil. Mamie walked the rest of the way to Mrs. Caldwell's with a peculiar feeling in her chest that it took her the better part of the evening to identify as the first real warmth she had felt since leaving Missouri. April gave way to May, and May in Texas was a different thing from May in Missouri. The heat arrived earlier and with more intention, and the wildflowers on the prairie were yellow and red and blazing with the brief, brilliant urgency of things that know their season is short. Mamie learned the rhythms of Harlan's Creek. She learned which children had enough to eat and which didn't, and she adjusted accordingly, as teachers on the frontier had always done, stretching the schoolroom's small resources in quiet ways that the children would not notice and their parents would not have to thank her for. She learned that Mrs. Caldwell's breakfast was, in fact, the best in the county, as Alfred had claimed, and that Mrs. Caldwell herself was a woman who had built something solid out of considerable loss, and saw no reason to speak about the loss when the something solid was right there to point to. She learned that Patrick Rourke laughed at everything with the same volume and commitment, whether it was genuinely funny or only moderately so, and that this was somehow entirely charming. She learned Alfred Rourke more slowly, the way you learn things that are worth knowing, by increments, by patience, by attention paid over time. She learned that he had come to Harlan's Creek from a place in southern Colorado 6 years ago, when his uncle had sent word that the blacksmith shop needed a second pair of hands and that there was good steady work and a future in it. She learned that he had built the decorative iron gate at the front of the church himself, the one with the small whorls of iron worked into the bars like frozen waves, and that he had done it as a gift to the congregation, and had told no one it was him for almost a year until Patrick Rourke, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret that made someone he loved look good, had told everyone at once over supper at the church social. She learned that he read, which surprised her less than it might have, because she had noticed already that he thought carefully before he spoke, which was usually the sign of a person who had somewhere acquired the habit of reading. He borrowed books from the small collection at the general store and from a traveling book merchant who came through Harlan's Creek twice a year, and sometimes, on Saturday afternoons when the shop was closed, he sat on the bench outside his door and read in the sun. One Saturday afternoon in May, she walked past on her way back from the creek, where she had gone to wash the week's accumulated chalk dust out of her second-best dress, and he was sitting on the bench with a book, and the light was long and gold the way it always seemed to be in that part of Texas in the late afternoon. "What are you reading?" she asked. He held up the cover. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that she recognized immediately and with something close to joy. "I have read that twice," she said. He looked up at her. "Which essay is your favorite?" "Self-reliance," she said without hesitation. Something moved in his face that was very close to a smile. "Mine too," he said. "Would you like to sit down?" She sat on the bench beside him, not close enough to cause comment, and they talked about the essay for almost an hour in the long May light, and it was one of the best conversations she had ever had with anyone. He had ideas about it that were different from hers, and he was not threatened by the difference, and she was not threatened by it either, and they went back and forth over the ideas like two people working a piece of iron between them, turning it over, finding the places where it held and the places where it needed more. When the light finally failed entirely and the stars began to appear, Mamie stood up and brushed her skirt and looked at him. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he said, but he did not make it easy for her to leave, which he did by the simple and entirely decent means of looking at her with those attentive brown eyes as if what they had been doing was exactly as important as she had felt it was. She walked back to Mrs. Caldwell's in the warm dark and sat at the kitchen table, and accepted the cup of chamomile tea that Mrs. Caldwell put in front of her without comment, though Mrs. Caldwell was watching her with the expression of a woman who already knows. "You were gone longer than a creek trip usually takes," Mrs. Caldwell said. "I was talking to Alfred Rourke," Mamie said. "I see," said Mrs. Caldwell and refilled her own cup. "He reads Emerson," Mamie said. "Does he?" said Mrs. Caldwell. "He has interesting ideas about self-reliance," Mamie said. "I'm sure he does," said Mrs. Caldwell, who was visibly and admirably restraining herself. June arrived and brought the school year toward its end, and with it the kind of busyness that masked feeling, which Mamie was not entirely unhappy about because she was not sure, yet, what she wanted to do with the feeling she had identified. She had spent the last several months learning to be skeptical of her own hopes, which had been repeatedly packed up and put on trains and sent back, and she did not want to misread what was happening between herself and Alfred Rourke, and find herself disappointed again in a town she had actually come to love. But Alfred Rourke was not a man who left things ambiguous for very long. On the third Saturday in June, he came to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house in the middle of the morning, wearing his cleaned-up coat and not his work clothes, and asked for Mamie at the door. Mrs. Caldwell answered, because she always answered the door and also because she had been expecting something of this nature for at least 3 weeks, and she called for Mamie and then retreated to the kitchen, though Mamie suspected she did not retreat very far. Alfred Rourke stood on the porch of the boarding house and looked at Mamie with the straightforward clarity that was, she had realized, his natural condition. He was always paying attention, always looking at things as they actually were, and now he was looking at her. "I would like to take you for a walk," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said, and got her hat. He took her to the south edge of town, past the church and past the last few houses, to where the prairie opened up and the grass was high and still green from the spring rains. They walked side by side in the June warmth, and for a while they said nothing, which was comfortable in the way that silences only are when two people are genuinely at ease with each other. "Miss Merriweather," he said finally. "Alfred," she said, because she had been calling him by his Christian name in her head for weeks, and it was past time. He looked at her sideways. "Mamie," he said, and the way he said it with that unhurried care he gave to things made it sound like her name was something he had been keeping safe. "Whatever you are trying to say," she said, "you can simply say it." "I know I can," he said. "I was working out the right words." "You could also use the approximately right words," she said. "I am not precise about words when the meaning is clear." He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. They were standing in the tall grass with the prairie wind moving around them and the town of Harlan's Creek behind them and the enormous Texas sky over everything, and Alfred Rourke looked at her with the full force of that attention she had come to know and said, "I think you should stay in Harlan's Creek." She looked at him. "I intend to," she said. "The town council has already offered to make my position permanent." "Not just for the school," he said. "I am asking you to stay because I want you to be here. I am asking because since the morning you walked off that train and nearly walked into me, I have thought about you every day with a persistence that I have not been able to account for any other way than the most obvious one. I am asking because I think we suit each other in a way that is not common and ought not to be wasted. And I am asking," he said, and his voice had gone quieter without going soft, "because you are the most real person I have encountered in a very long time, and I would very much like for you not to get back on any more trains." Mamie looked at him for a long moment in the June grass under the Texas sky. The wind moved her hair. A meadowlark somewhere to the left was singing its repeated looping song. "Are you asking me to marry you, Alfred Rourke?" she said. "I am working up to it," he said. "I thought it was worth saying the reasons first." "The reasons are good," she said. "Then the question is, will you allow me to keep working up to it, to court you properly and ask you formally when we have had sufficient time for you to be sure?" She thought about the 3 trains and the 3 towns and the 3 men who had found her unsuitable. She thought about Clarence Hooper, who had wanted gratitude. She thought about Gordon Fitch, who had wanted silence. She thought about Bert Sallies, who had wanted not to be noticed. She thought about the promise she had made to herself in the dark of the train car, that she would plant herself somewhere and make her own life, and how Harlan's Creek had already become that place, and how Alfred Rourke had, somewhere in the course of May and June, become part of the texture of it in a way she had not planned and did not regret. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He smiled then, fully, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand she had been seeing only part of it all this time, that the careful, attentive expression was real, but this was also real, this warmth that arrived like light arriving when a cloud moves. They walked back to town in the early afternoon, and this time they walked a little closer, not enough to be scandalous but enough to be clear, and Mrs. Caldwell, who was on her front porch shelling peas when they returned, watched their approach with the satisfied expression of a woman who has been right about something for long enough that the confirmation is deeply pleasing. The summer unfolded the way summers do in Texas, when a person has found their place in one long and hot and full of small events that accumulate into a life. Mamie continued to live at Mrs. Caldwell's because propriety was a real consideration in a small town, and because she had no desire to give the council any reason to doubt her character. And Alfred courted her in the way he did everything, with steadiness and attention and occasional surprising gestures that she had not expected from a man who operated primarily in the practical. He brought her a book from the traveling merchant when he came through in July, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that was slightly scandalous in polite circles, which she took as a sign that Alfred Rourke understood her better than she had known. He fixed the latch on the schoolhouse door that had been sticking since March, which she had mentioned only once and in passing, and he did it on a Saturday morning before she arrived so that she found it simply done, no announcement. He invited her to Sunday dinner at Patrick Rourke's house, where Patrick and his wife, who was called Eleanor and was just as loud as her husband and twice as kind, fed them both an extraordinary amount of food and talked over each other with cheerful relentlessness. And Mamie felt, sitting at that crowded table with the warm noise of it around her, that she had been admitted into something. One evening in late July, when the heat had finally eased a little toward sundown, and they were sitting outside on the bench in front of the blacksmith shop in what had become a regular Saturday evening arrangement, Alfred showed her what he was working on. It was a length of iron that he was shaping into something decorative, and when she looked at it closely in the remaining light, she saw that it was a set of letters. Her initials, MM, worked into a scrolling pattern that would fit on a garden gate. "Who is this for?" she asked, though she had a fair idea. "It is for a house that does not yet have a garden gate," he said, "but I am hoping it will." "Alfred," she said. "I know," he said. "Too soon." "No," she said, "not too soon. I just wanted to say your name the way you said mine that day in the grass." He looked at her with those brown eyes that had been paying attention to her all summer with the kind of care she had not known she was waiting for, and she looked at him with the full directness that had sent 3 men running, and neither of them flinched. "I love you," she said, because she was a direct woman and the idea of waiting for the right moment when the moment was right here seemed wasteful. "I love you," he said back, without hesitation, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He did not kiss her that evening because they were on a public bench on the main street of a small town, but he took her hand and held it in both of his in the warm July dark, and that was enough. That was, in fact, considerable. August arrived with the full authority of a Texas summer, and with it, a development that complicated things in a way Mamie had not anticipated. A man arrived in Harlan's Creek on the morning train, not looking for a bride, not looking for the blacksmith, but looking for the schoolteacher. His name was Harold Greenlee, and he was from the County Education Board, which had recently extended its oversight to include the smaller frontier schools in the region. He arrived in a suit that was too hot for August and an expression that suggested he was aware of this, and resented it. He observed Mamie's class for an entire morning, writing in a small notebook with the focused energy of a man who is looking for problems. The children, who were by now thoroughly accustomed to Mamie and deeply loyal to her in the particular way of frontier children who have been genuinely taught rather than merely supervised, behaved exactly as they always did, engaged, curious, occasionally distracting each other, and responsive to the slightest redirect from Mamie in a way that was, she knew, its own kind of evidence. After the class was dismissed, Harold Greenlee sat across from her at the teacher's desk and told her that the county board had concerns about frontier schools being run by women without formal teaching certificates. He told her that the board was considering requiring all frontier teachers to hold a certificate from an accredited institution. He told her that she would have 3 months to produce documentation, or the board would need to reassign the position. Mamie was very calm during this conversation. She had become good at remaining calm when things required it, and she was very calm now. "I have letters of reference from the school board in Hannibal, Missouri," she said. "From the parents of students I taught there, and from the minister of my church, who can speak to my character. I have 2 years of documented experience. The children in this classroom are currently reading and doing sums at levels the board would find impressive. I do not have a formal certificate because there was no school of education available to me, as I believe you know is the case for most frontier educators." "The board is not questioning your competence," Greenlee said, which was the kind of sentence that always preceded something that questioned a person's competence. "The board is establishing standards. Standards that will eliminate competent teachers from frontier communities that have no other options," she said. Greenlee looked at her with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to having his institutional logic questioned quite so directly. He said he would report his findings to the board, and that they would be in touch. Mamie walked directly from the schoolhouse to the blacksmith's shop. Alfred was at the anvil and looked up when she came in, and he took one look at her face and put the iron down. She told him everything Greenlee had said. Alfred listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment with the particular quiet that meant he was thinking, not avoiding. "Write to Hannibal today," he said. "Get those reference letters sent here as documentation. Write up a summary of what the children have learned this year with specific examples. Let me talk to Patterson at the general store. He is on the county committee for school funding, and he has a relationship with the board." "I am not going to be chased off by a man with a notebook," she said. "I know you are not," Alfred said. "I am not suggesting you be. I am suggesting you fight it strategically and with everything available." She looked at him. "You are very good at this," she said. "At what?" "Being beside someone," she said. He looked at her with that warm, direct thing that she had come to think of as uniquely his. "I intend to be very good at it for a very long time," he said. She went home and wrote the letters. Alfred talked to Patterson, who talked to his contacts, who talked to the relevant people on the board. Mamie wrote a 12-page document detailing the curriculum she had delivered, the progress of each student by name, and the specific outcomes she could demonstrate. She asked Mrs. Caldwell to write a letter, and Mrs. Caldwell wrote a letter that was, by all reports, very impressive in its directness. The Reverend wrote a letter. Patrick Rourke, who had no official standing in any of this but had very strong feelings, wrote a letter that Patrick's wife Alina had to revise for tone before it was sent. In September, the county board informed her by written communication that her position was confirmed. Her documentation had been deemed sufficient. There was a note at the bottom of the letter, not entirely unlike an apology, about the importance of experienced educators in frontier communities. Mamie read the letter at Mrs. Caldwell's breakfast table and felt the specific satisfaction of a battle won through the correct means. Then she went to the blacksmith's shop and told Alfred. He lifted her off the ground, which she had not expected, and which she was fairly certain he had not entirely planned, and she made a sound of surprise that turned into a laugh that she could not recall having laughed since before her mother died. "Alfred," she said, still laughing, "put me down." "In a moment," he said, which was not a thing she had expected him to say, and he said it with a smile that she was still not accustomed to, the full one, because every time it arrived it managed to surprise her. He put her down, and they were close together in the open doorway of the blacksmith's shop on a September morning with the whole town of Harlan's Creek available as witnesses, and he kissed her for the first time, briefly and with intention, and it was nothing like the shy, apologetic things she had read about in the novels Mrs. Caldwell kept on her parlor shelf. It was like being recognized. They were married in November, at the church in Harlan's Creek, with Reverend Gaines officiating and every member of the congregation in attendance and Patrick Rourke crying with more volume than the occasion strictly required. Mrs. Caldwell wore her best dress, and stood in the front pew with the composed expression of a woman receiving confirmation of her own judgment. The children from Mamie's school sat in a row near the back, scrubbed and serious, and the littlest one, a girl of 6 named Clara who had spent the first week of school hiding behind her slate, produced from somewhere a small bunch of late-season wildflowers and pressed them into Mamie's hand at the church door without saying anything. Mamie pressed them back into her own hands and carried them up the aisle. Alfred was waiting at the front of the church in his cleaned-up coat, and when he saw her coming toward him down the aisle of the small church in Harlan's Creek with Clara's wildflowers in her hands and her best blue dress and her green eyes looking at him without the slightest reservation, he looked at her with the full force of his attention in a way that made every other person in the room temporarily irrelevant, and Mamie felt the particular certainty of a person who has arrived somewhere true. They moved into the house he had been preparing on the east side of town, a solid house, not large but well built, with windows that let in the morning light and a kitchen that was a reasonable size and a parlor with a good stone fireplace, and on the front of the property, a garden gate with iron scrollwork that incorporated in a pattern of leaves and vines. Mamie stood at the gate on the day they moved in and looked at it for a long time. "You made this months ago," she said. "February," he said. She turned to look at him. "We did not meet until April." "I know," he said. "I made it for a gate I did not yet have, and then I met you and the letters happened to match." She looked at him steadily. "That is either a very remarkable coincidence or a very good story." His mouth curved. "It is a very good story," he admitted. She laughed and pushed the gate open and walked into her own garden, where the November earth was brown and waiting for spring. The winter was cold but not cruel, the way Texas winters sometimes were, and they spent it in the way of people who are genuinely learning each other in close quarters, with patience and some adjustments, and the discovery that the qualities that had seemed self-contained in a person become different in daily life. Alfred's quietness, which had felt considered from across a bench, was sometimes simply quietness in the early morning before coffee, which required no interpretation. Mamie's directness, which had sent 3 men running, was in their house simply the texture of daily conversation. She said what she meant and he said what he meant, and neither of them had to guess, which was its own kind of luxury. They had disagreements. Once in January, about money, and what portion to put aside for the school supplies she wanted to buy with her own salary versus what Alfred thought was reasonable to save. The disagreement was not long and not loud, but it was real, and it ended not with one of them capitulating but with both of them finding the actual middle ground, which was a different thing and better. Once in February, Mamie came home from school in a state of quiet distress that Alfred noticed immediately, and when she told him that one of her students, a boy of 12 named Thomas whose father worked a struggling cattle operation east of town, had come to school 3 days running without lunch or breakfast, Alfred had his coat on before she finished the sentence. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Patterson's," he said. "The store keeps a tab for community needs. I will add Thomas's family to it anonymously, and Patterson will manage the rest." "I was going to say we could send something from our own kitchen," she said. "We can do both," he said. She stood in the kitchen and looked at him putting on his coat and hat, and going out into the February cold to solve a problem for a 12-year-old boy whose name he had only just learned, and felt something that was past gratitude and past love but contained both of them. Something that was the particular feeling of recognizing in another person a set of values so close to your own that their presence makes you more entirely yourself. Spring came, and with it the second school year, and the enrollment grew. 2 new families had moved to Harlan's Creek over the winter, bringing 4 more children, and the schoolhouse was crowded in a way that was a good problem to have. Mamie wrote to the council about expanding the building, and the council, which had by now become accustomed to Mamie Merriweather Rourke presenting them with well-reasoned proposals, agreed with minimal argument. Alfred built the extension himself on evenings and Saturdays, with Patrick Rourke helping on weekends and complaining cheerfully about his back the entire time. By autumn, the schoolhouse had 6 more desks and a second window, and Mamie stood in the expanded room with the morning light coming through both windows and felt that particular wordless satisfaction of having made something real. In the fall of 1883, a year after they had married, Mamie realized that she was expecting a child. She told Alfred on a Sunday evening in October, sitting by the stone fireplace in the parlor with the fire going and the wind outside, and the house holding them both in its good solid walls. She told him plainly, because she did not know how else to say important things. Alfred Rourke was quiet for a moment that was long enough that she had time to notice how the firelight moved. Then he leaned forward and took her hands in both of his, the way he had in the July dark on the bench, and he looked at her with his full attention and said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am happy." "So am I," he said. "I am very, very happy." He kissed her hands with the same intention with which he did everything, and they sat by the fire for a long time without needing to say very much more about it, which was its own kind of eloquence. Thomas arrived in June of 1884, during a thunderstorm that moved across the Texas plain with dramatic efficiency, as if providing appropriate atmosphere for the occasion. He was a healthy and opinionated infant who announced himself with considerable volume, and showed no signs of ever reducing that volume, and who had Alfred's dark hair and Mamie's green eyes in a combination that made Patrick Rourke cry for the second time in Mamie's presence, which she was beginning to understand, was simply how Patrick responded to things of importance. Mamie had arranged for a woman in town named Mrs. Harper, whose own children were grown, to help with Thomas during school days, and she returned to teaching when Thomas was 2 months old. There were women who thought this was too soon, and there were women who understood it completely, and Mamie accepted both responses with equanimity. She had never been the kind of woman who could be fully herself while leaving half of herself at home, and she had married a man who had understood that from the beginning. Alfred came by the schoolhouse one afternoon in the fall of 1884, which was unusual enough that the children all sat up very straight when he appeared in the doorway. He was holding Thomas on one arm with the practiced ease of a man who has spent months learning how to hold a child while keeping his other hand free, and Thomas was gnawing on something that was probably not entirely appropriate but was clearly effective, and Alfred looked at Mamie over the heads of 11 attentive children with that warm, familiar clarity. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. "You are always interrupting," said the oldest student, a 14-year-old girl named Ruth, with the unfiltered accuracy of adolescence. Several students giggled. Mamie did not quite hide her smile. "We are doing arithmetic," she told Alfred. "Then I will leave you to it," he said, and turned to go, and then turned back. "Mrs. Harper sends word that Thomas had his lunch without incident and is very pleased with himself." "Thank him for telling me," Mamie said, which was a slightly complicated sentence because she was thanking Alfred for relaying a message from Mrs. Harper about Thomas, and all 3 of them were men in her life in different configurations, and Thomas was at this moment blowing a small bubble of contentment from his position on his father's arm. She heard Alfred laughing to himself as he walked away, a quiet sound that she recognized across the schoolyard as specifically his. Harlan's creek grew. That was the nature of the frontier in the 1880s. Towns either grew or they did not, and the ones that did became something and the ones that didn't became memories, and Harlan's Creek was a growing town. New families arrived, drawn by the cattle trade and by the railroad spur that was extended to the area in 1884, and with them came new children for the school and new commerce for the town, and a new energy that felt like possibility rather than threat. A proper hotel went up in 1885, and a milliner's shop, and the church expanded its building, and Alfred's shop took on a second apprentice because there was more work than 2 pairs of hands could manage. Mamie's school grew to 22 students, which required 2 additional desks and a considerable adjustment in her organizational approach, but she managed it with the methodical creativity that was her professional signature. They had their disagreements over the years, as all people who are genuinely together rather than merely adjacent do. About money, occasionally, because resources were always limited on the frontier, and the question of which needs came first was sometimes complicated. About how to handle a particular difficult situation with a student's family, when Mamie's instinct was to be more direct than Alfred thought wise. About the question of whether Alfred should take a large commission from a wealthy rancher in a neighboring county that would mean 3 weeks away, which he ultimately declined, and about whether Mamie was glad he had declined it, which she was, though she would have supported him if he had gone. But the disagreements were part of the texture of a real life, not evidence against it, and they had both always known the difference between problems that required solving and friction that was simply the evidence of 2 whole people occupying the same space. In 1886, their second child came. Another boy, this one with Mamie's brown hair and Alfred's steady temperament, who arrived on a cold February morning in considerably less dramatic fashion than Thomas had managed, and who was accordingly named William, because after the theatrical arrival of Thomas, it seemed right to give this quieter child a quieter name. William Patrick, in deference to Patrick Rourke, who had by now become so thoroughly a grandfather in function that giving him the middle name honor was simply honest. Patrick cried predictably. Thomas, who was nearly 2½, inspected his brother with the critical assessment of a person who has not been consulted about a major household decision, and who is not sure he endorses it. He decided, over the course of 3 days, that William was acceptable, and this endorsement was offered in the form of Thomas placing one of his most prized objects, a smooth, flat river stone he had been carrying since the previous summer, into the cradle beside his sleeping brother, and walking away with the dignified satisfaction of someone who has made a generous gesture. Mamie watched this from the doorway and then went to find Alfred and tell him, and they stood together in the doorway of the parlor watching Thomas examine William with the river stone, and Alfred put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the easy comfort of a person who has been doing this long enough that it has become as natural as breathing. "He is going to be a good brother," Alfred said. "He is already being one," Mamie said. Life in Harlan's Creek was not without its difficulties. The frontier in the 1880s was not a gentle place for everyone, and Mamie was aware of this in ways that were not abstract. She was aware that the Comanche people who had ranged across these plains for generations had been forced onto reservations, and that this fact sat beneath the life of every town in the region whether the people in those towns acknowledged it or not. She acknowledged it. She was also aware of the particular difficulties faced by the few black families who had come to Harlan's Creek seeking a new life, who encountered not the open welcome that the frontier's mythology sometimes promised, but the more complicated and often hostile reality that race relations in the 1880s, even in the West, too often produced. There was a family named the Washingtons who arrived in 1885, a man, his wife, and their 3 children who wanted to settle in Harlan's Creek. James Washington had skills as a carpenter, and his wife Ida was a capable seamstress, and they had come west like many others in search of something better. Mamie enrolled their children in her school, which was not a difficult decision for her, but created a difficult situation with several families in town who came to her privately with their objections. She listened to those objections calmly and completely, and then she said, with the directness that had been her distinguishing quality since the beginning, that all children in the town were welcome in her school, and that this would not change. 2 families removed their children from the school for a period of 3 weeks. This was painful and it was real, and Mamie did not pretend otherwise. Alfred was steady beside her in it, and the council was divided, and Mrs. Caldwell wrote another of her remarkable letters to everyone who needed to receive one, and eventually the 2 families returned, because the schoolteacher was the only one available, and because Mamie had managed, in the meantime, to make her school so clearly the best available option for every child in the area that removing a child from it was plainly a disadvantage. The Washington children thrived, and their parents built something real in Harlan's Creek, and Mamie was glad of it. She was not naive about what they continued to face, and she was not able to solve the full weight of what the 1880s frontier asked of people who arrived without the advantage of the color of a white skin. But she could make her classroom a place where every child was taught with equal seriousness, and she did, and she believed this was the right use of the influence she had. Alfred was asked in 1887 to take on the management of the town's infrastructure needs in addition to his own shop, to oversee the ironwork for the new civic buildings, the new water pump system the town was installing, the maintenance of the various structures that a growing town accumulated. He talked to Mamie about it before accepting, which was his way, not asking her permission, which he did not believe he needed and which she would not have expected, but genuinely consulting her because they had built a life together that involved actual consultation. It would mean less time in the shop, he said. More organizing, more people management, more time away from the work I enjoy. But the shop would continue, she said. With the 2 apprentices, yes. I would oversee rather than work primarily. Would you be good at the organizing? She asked. He considered. Yes, he said. I think I would. Then you already know what you want to do, she said. I wanted to hear your thinking, he said. My thinking is that you are very good at organizing and that you have been managing the shop and the apprentices and the town requests and your own work for 3 years, and you have done it well. Doing it formally and for compensation seems like a reasonable progression. He accepted the position. He was, as she had assessed, very good at it. Thomas started school in the fall of 1888. Which was the specific experience of having your own child show up in your classroom, which Mamie had considered from a theoretical distance, and which arrived in practice with considerably more emotion than she had anticipated. Thomas Rourke was 4.5 years old, and he sat in the second row, and he looked at his mother at the front of the classroom with an expression of considerable seriousness, as if they had agreed in advance to maintain professional standards. She taught him as she taught every student, without favoritism, and without the opposite of favoritism, which was a different error. He was a quick learner and a disruptive influence, and deeply beloved by his classmates within 2 weeks, all of which she had expected. In 1889, the years having accumulated into a life that was full and real and varied in its textures, Alfred came home one evening in November with a look on his face that she recognized as the one he wore when something significant had happened, and he was arranging it before speaking. "Tell me," she said, from the kitchen, where she was dealing with supper. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I had a letter today from a property agent in Colorado," he said. "The town of Granger, which is about 40 miles from where I grew up. There is a large contract available, civic ironwork for an entire new town center. It would take 6 months. In Colorado," she said. "In Colorado," he said. She turned from the stove. Thomas was in the parlor doing homework with a degree of enthusiasm that suggested he was doing it because he was actually interested, which happened sometimes. William was asleep already, being a reliable and consistent sleeper in all weathers, one of his more admirable qualities. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want to know what you think," he said. "Alfred," she said, "that is not the same question." He looked at her. "I want to go," he said. "I think it is a significant opportunity and I want to do it, but I do not want to take my family 6 months away from their home if you are not willing." "Would we all go?" she said. "If you are willing." She thought about the school, which now had a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Abbott who had arrived the previous year and who was fully capable of managing the classroom for a semester. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, which they had moved out of years ago but which she still walked past every morning and which felt reliably like a marker of the beginning of something. She thought about the iron gate with in the scrollwork. "Yes," she said, "we will all go." The 6 months in Colorado were the adventure that their life in Harlan's Creek, which was good but which had settled into its patterns, had not been able to provide. They lived in rented rooms in Granger, which was a raw new town with the energy of a place that is becoming rather than a place that has been. And Alfred worked long days on the civic project and came home smelling of iron and smoke and satisfied in the specific way of a man doing the work he is genuinely suited for at full scale. Thomas attended the Granger School and made 3 friends in the first week through the sheer force of personality that had always been his particular gift. William, who was 4, spent his Colorado months in a sustained state of wonder at the mountains, which could be seen from the town's main street, and which were, in his young experience, the most interesting things he had ever seen. Mamie found a women's reading circle in Granger that met on Thursday evenings, and she attended for all 6 months, and she brought them all the books she had and they brought her theirs, and she came home from those Thursday evenings restored in a specific way, the way you are restored when you have spent time with people who take ideas seriously. They returned to Harlan's Creek in the spring of 1890, with Alfred's reputation considerably enhanced, and with a small amount of money saved from the Colorado work that they used to add a bedroom to the house on the east side of town, because Thomas and William were at the age where sharing a room was becoming a diplomatic negotiation rather than a practical arrangement. The bedroom addition took Alfred and Patrick Rourke the better part of the summer to complete, and Patrick complained about his back throughout, in a voice that had taken on a new rasp that Mamie noticed with a quiet concern she did not express because she was not certain yet that it was significant. It was significant. Patrick Rourke was diagnosed in the fall of 1890 with a condition of the lungs that the doctor in the county seat attributed to 30 years of working a forge and breathing iron dust, and which was, the doctor said, manageable but not reversible. Patrick received this news with the same loud, robust approach he brought to everything, which meant he announced it to everyone who mattered at once, and spent the first week of the diagnosis making others feel better about it, which was so perfectly Patrick that Mamie had to excuse herself from the room for a moment when she first witnessed it. The months that followed were a particular kind of difficult, not sharp, and sudden the way the worst losses are, but gradual and requiring sustained attention, which can be its own kind of hard. Alfred managed the change to his uncle's health with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything difficult, visiting every day, taking on the shop work that Patrick could no longer do, managing the apprentices with an eye toward making sure the shop's reputation was maintained without Patrick's direct presence. Eleanor Rourke, who was as large in personality as her husband, became quieter in this period but not diminished. She was a woman who conserved her strength for what required it. Mamie cooked and carried and organized, and was present in the ways that a woman who loves her family knows how to be present. And she let Alfred be sad when he was sad without trying to resolve it for him, because she had learned that the kindest thing you can do for someone's grief is to sit beside it honestly rather than attempt to hurry it toward the other side. Patrick Rourke died in the summer of 1891, in his own bed in his own house with Eleanor holding one hand and Alfred holding the other, and Mamie standing in the doorway of the room with Thomas and William on either side of her, because Patrick had asked for the whole family to be close, which was completely consistent with everything he had ever been. It was a loss that left a specific shape in their lives, because Patrick had been the person who had brought Alfred to Harlan's Creek, who had been present at the beginning of everything, who had cried at the wedding and at the births, and who had been so entirely, reliably himself that the absence of him left a volume of silence that took time to fill. They planted a tree on the property beside the church in Patrick's memory, a live oak that the climate of that part of Texas would support for a very long time, and Alfred made a small iron marker for it that included Patrick's initials and the dates of his life. The marker was simple and well made, and Mamie watched Alfred install it in the ground beside the young tree, and thought that this was entirely the right thing, to mark a life with something that would last. Life continued, as it does, and continued to be full. Miss Abbott married in 1892 and left the school, and Mamie found a replacement, a young man from Austin named Hayes who had genuine teaching ability and who turned out to be one of the best classroom decisions she had ever made. Thomas turned 10 in 1894 and showed signs of his father's interest in practical things, spending his free time in the blacksmith's shop with Alfred learning the basics of ironwork, with the same focused attention that Alfred had always brought to things, except that Thomas also brought Patrick Rourke's volume, so the shop was considerably noisier than it had been. William at 8 was a methodical and thoughtful reader who reminded Mamie of herself at that age in ways that she found both touching and slightly alarming, having full knowledge of where that particular type of personality eventually led. Alfred and Mamie had settled, by the mid-1890s, into the deep particular intimacy of a long marriage, not the first fire of attraction, but the sustained warmth of two people who have made a life together with genuine intention, and who know each other in the complete way that only time and difficulty and dailiness can produce. He still took her hand in the July dark, metaphorically speaking. He still noticed when she was tired before she said so, still brought her coffee in the mornings before she was fully awake, still looked at her across a room with that quality of attention that had been there from the beginning on the main street of Harlan's Creek, and which had not diminished with familiarity, but had instead deepened into something richer and more encompassing. She still surprised him. She said things that made him laugh that no one else could have said to him. She solved problems in her classroom and in the community with a combination of directness and creativity that he had long since stopped trying to predict, because the prediction was never as good as the actual thing. She had opinions about everything, and she was right about most of them, and when she was wrong she said so without elaboration, which was its own kind of quality. In 1895, Mamie was offered the position of head of schools for the county, a newly created administrative role that would put her in charge of curriculum and standards for 12 schools across the region. It was a significant step, the kind of step that a woman in 1895 was not often offered, and it was offered because her reputation as the teacher who had grown the Harlan's Creek School from 11 students to 31 over 13 years, who had fought the county board and won, who had expanded the schoolhouse and trained other teachers and maintained standards that the board's own inspectors had twice cited as exemplary, had preceded her to a degree that the county board had finally stopped being able to ignore. She told Alfred that evening, at the kitchen table where they had had most of their important conversations over 13 years, with supper on and the boys doing homework in the parlor and the November wind outside sounding very much as it had in the first winter they had spent in the house. "What do you think?" she said, and it was the same question he had asked her about Colorado, the same genuine consultation. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "I think," he said, "that this is the right opportunity for someone who has been building toward it since the moment she walked off a train with a carpetbag and refused to get back on one." She looked at him. "You make it sound inevitable." "It is not inevitable," he said. "Inevitable would have happened without all the work. This is the result of everything you have done." "We have done," she said. "Some of it," he said. "The teaching is yours." She accepted the position. The county board was pleased with their own progressiveness in appointing her, and she accepted this with the equanimity of a woman who understands that institutions frequently congratulate themselves for decisions that individuals force them toward, and she used the appointment to do the work she had intended without worrying very much about the congratulations. She kept the Harlan's Creek classroom, in the sense that she remained involved in its work. Mr. Hayes managed it day to day, but she was in it twice a week and was present for the school year's significant moments. because she was not a woman who could be entirely removed from the place where she had started, the room with the 2 windows and the expanded walls and 31 desks, and the blackboard that was no longer chalky and dim. Thomas turned 16 in 1900, which was a year that felt, in its roundness, like something, the century turning, the frontier changing, the railroads having spread their influence far enough that the particular wildness of the 1880s was becoming something else, something more settled and less raw, still real but different. Alfred had watched this change with a mixed feeling that he articulated once, on a Saturday afternoon on the bench in front of the shop, in the continuing tradition of Saturday afternoons on that bench, as a sense that the world he had come to in his youth was being replaced by something that was not necessarily worse but was certainly other. "Do you miss it?" Mamie asked. "The early years of it." He thought about it honestly, which was how he thought about everything. "I miss the feeling of everything being possible," he said, "not the actual difficulties, the feeling." "Things are still possible," she said. "Different things," he said. "Better things, some of them," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Better things, some of them." William, who was 14 in 1900 and had been growing steadily into the thoughtful, methodical person he had always seemed to contain in potential, announced that he wanted to become a doctor, which was not a statement that surprised either of his parents, given that he had been reading medical texts borrowed from the county physician since he was 11. The county physician, Dr. Marcus, had in fact been encouraging this inclination for years, recognizing in William the kind of precise, careful thinking that medicine required. Alfred and Mamie began making plans for William's education, which would eventually require him to leave Harlan's Creek for a proper school. Thomas, for his part, had decided by 16 with characteristic certainty that he would take over the blacksmith's shop, which was what he had been preparing for since he first walked into it at Thomas's age, with the focused intention of someone who already knew their direction. Alfred began training him formally, and Thomas applied himself with the same quality of full commitment that he had always brought to the things he cared about. The new century settled in, and Harlan's Creek settled with it, not quieter exactly, but more defined. The rough edges of the frontier town had smoothed somewhat, though not entirely, because places that grow from that particular beginning keep something of it, a directness and a practicality that is its own kind of inheritance. The live oak planted for Patrick beside the church had grown considerably and provided real shade now on the south side of the building, and Mamie walked past it every morning on her way to the schoolhouse and felt, each time, the presence of the man who had not lived to see it this size. Alfred Rourke was 72 in 1901 and showed no signs of becoming any less present in the life of the town or the family, which was a considerable comfort. She had a new friend now, in the form of William, who came to her house twice a week to talk to her about the historical and medical texts he was reading, because Alfred Rourke had, as it turned out, a mind for this sort of thing that had not previously had sufficient outlet, and which had found in William's serious bookish enthusiasm an ideal recipient. They sat together in Alfred's parlor and argued about things that neither Thomas nor Alfred could be induced to have an opinion about, and it was one of the more unlikely and entirely pleasing developments of the new century. Mamie's work as head of county schools took her, across the early years of the 1900s, to all 12 schools in the region, and she saw in this work the full range of what the frontier had been and was becoming: schools that were thriving and schools that were failing, children who had everything available to them and children who were going without the most basic resources, teachers who were gifted and dedicated, and teachers who were out of their depth but doing their best. She brought to all of it the same direct, practical energy she had always brought, and she made changes where she could make them and advocated for resources where she could not, and she wrote reports to the board that were models of clear reasoning and specific documentation. In 1904, William left for medical school in Austin. He was 18 years old, and the morning he left on the train, the same train line that had brought Mamie to Harlan's Creek 22 years earlier, though the train itself was newer and the platform had been improved. Mamie stood on the platform with Alfred beside her and watched her methodical, thoughtful second son climb the steps to the passenger car, and felt the particular double nature of parental pride, which is that it contains in it the very thing it celebrates: the growing up, the going away, the becoming. Alfred put his arm around her on the platform as the train pulled out, and she leaned into him in the way that was now as natural as breathing, and they watched the train carry William away and then walked back to their house on the east side of town together in the morning. Thomas was 20 years old by 1904, fully managing the blacksmith shop with 2 apprentices of his own, a young man of 19 named Cal, and a boy of 16 whose name was Hector, and who had the hands of someone who would be exceptional at ironwork when he had a few more years of practice. Thomas had also, Mamie and Alfred had both noticed, developed a particular habit of being in the vicinity of Ruth Patterson, daughter of the general store owner Patterson, whenever Ruth Patterson was anywhere near the main street. Ruth was 21 and had returned to Harlan's Creek after 2 years at a women's academy in Dallas, and she was intelligent and direct, and had the kind of eyes that made Thomas Rourke, who was not generally shy about anything, noticeably quiet. Mamie watched this situation with enormous quiet interest and considerable restraint about commenting on it, though Mrs. Caldwell, who was 71 in 1904 and had lost very little of her clarity, commented on it frequently and without any visible restraint at all. Alfred was, in this as in many things, more patient than his wife. "They will work it out," he said, when Mamie remarked on the situation one evening in early spring. "I know they will," she said. "I simply find the process very interesting to observe." "You are exactly like Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "I am nothing like Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "You are exactly like her, and you know it," he said, with the specific quality of patience and affection that had become the defining note of the long middle of their marriage, the way music has themes that recur. Thomas and Ruth began openly courting in the summer of 1904, when Thomas apparently decided that the quiet observation phase had gone on long enough and that a direct approach was consistent with everything his mother had ever taught him, which Mamie found both gratifying and, when she thought about it, very funny. Alfred laughed when she told him this analysis. "He comes by it honestly," he said. "From me," she said. "From you," he agreed. They were married, Thomas and Ruth, in the spring of 1905. At the same church where Alfred and Mamie had married 23 years earlier, with Reverend Gaines' successor officiating, because Reverend Gaines had retired the previous year to live with his daughter in San Antonio, and had been replaced by a younger man named Reverend Cole, who had the good sense to give a short sermon. Mrs. Caldwell was there, 72 years old and present in the front pew with the same composed expression she had worn at Alfred and Mamie's wedding, the expression of a woman whose judgment has been repeatedly vindicated. Eleanor Rourke cried, in the loud and committed way that had always been Patrick's and that had apparently transferred to Eleanor in his absence, as if the family required a volume of emotional expression to be maintained, and Eleanor had taken on the responsibility. William, who had come home from Austin for the wedding, stood next to his brother at the front of the church and watched Thomas with the expression of a person who is simultaneously very happy for his brother and very aware that he is the next one in line for this particular social expectation. William was 20 years old and was not currently courting anyone in particular, and Mamie had no intention of saying anything about this because she was well aware of where that kind of pressure had led in her own history, and she was not going to apply it to her son. She did not say anything. Alfred caught her not saying anything, and they had, over Thomas's wedding reception at the Rourke house, a brief silent conversation about it that consisted of a look and a slight shake of Alfred's head and a slight lifting of Mamie's hands that meant she knew, and she was not going to. Thomas and Ruth moved into a new house on the west side of town, which Thomas had been building for the previous year in the evenings after the shop closed, and which Alfred had helped with on weekends in the established family tradition of Rourke men building things for the people they loved. In 1906, Thomas and Ruth had a son, which they named Patrick Alfred, and the name arrived at the Rourke family dinner table where Eleanor was present and produced another round of Eleanor's tears, and a silence from Alfred that lasted exactly long enough for Mamie to reach across the table and take his hand. Little Patrick Alfred Rourke had, as it turned out, his great-uncle's broad red face and something of Patrick's quality of immediate robust presence, which was observed by everyone at the family's first gathering around him, and acknowledged without being said aloud, because some things are understood rather than stated. Mamie stood in the spring of 1907 at the garden gate of her house on the east side of Harlan's Creek, the gate with M.M. in the iron scrollwork that Alfred had made in February of 1882 for a gate he did not yet have, and watched the main street of the town she had landed on by accident and decision and her own stubbornness, and thought about the morning 25 years ago when she had stepped off a train with a carpetbag and $23 and a promise she had made to herself. She had told herself she would plant herself somewhere and make her own life. She had, in fact, done exactly that. The life was richer than she had known how to imagine in the dark of a train car crossing the Texas plain, but it was recognizably the thing she had aimed at, real and full and hers. Alfred came out of the house behind her with 2 cups of coffee, because it was a Saturday morning and Saturday mornings were still, 25 years on, the time when they had their best conversations on the bench in front of the shop in the early days, and on the porch steps of this house as the years had made the house their own, and now at the gate, with the April morning around them and the town waking up on the other side of the iron scrollwork. He handed her the coffee and stood beside her at the gate, and they looked out at the main street of Harlan's Creek together in the April light. "Mrs. Caldwell's light is on," Mamie said. The boarding house was visible from here, 3rd house past the church. "It is always on at this hour," Alfred said. "She is making breakfast for her current guests." "She will outlast us all," Mamie said, with genuine affection. "I think she might," Alfred agreed. They were quiet for a moment in the good spring morning. A wagon went past on the main street. The live oak by the church had grown to the size of a real tree, spreading its canopy over Patrick Rourke's small iron marker in the morning shadow. Thomas's shop was closed on Saturday mornings, the same schedule as Alfred's had always been, but the apprentice Cal was inside because Mamie had seen the smoke from the forge when she had looked that direction. "Do you remember the day I walked off the train?" she said. "I nearly walked into you," he said. "I was carrying iron and not watching where I was going." "I was watching the buildings," she said. "Cataloging the town," he said, and she heard the smile in it without looking at him. "I was," she admitted. "I do not know exactly why I got off the train here. I had told myself I would get off at the next stop if the next man sent me back too, and so I did, but I could just as easily have stayed on to Amarillo." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you did not stay on to Amarillo." "So am I," she said, "though I think Amarillo would have been fine." "Probably," he said, "but I would not have been there." She looked at him then. This man she had been married to for 25 years, who had watched her arrive in the town he had made his home and had said, within 6 months, with the simple directness of a man who knew what he was looking at, that she should stay. He had gray at his temples now, and the lines of his face had deepened with time and work, but the eyes were the same, that quality of full attention that had recognized her from the very beginning and had not required her to be smaller or quieter or less entirely herself in order to be welcome. "No," she said, "you would not have been there." He put his arm around her at the gate, and she leaned into him in the way that had become, over 25 years, entirely the shape of how she fit into the world, and they stood together in the April morning of 1907 in the town of Harlan's Creek, Texas, looking at the life they had made, which was considerable and which was theirs. The town went about its Saturday morning around them. Mrs. Caldwell's boarders would be sitting down to the breakfast that was still, by all accounts, the best in the county. William was somewhere in Austin becoming a doctor. Thomas was home with Ruth and little Patrick Alfred, who was almost a year old and had already demonstrated Patrick Rourke's approach to any room he found himself in, which was to make himself immediately known. Eleanor was in her house with the medical texts that William sent her regularly, reading them at 78 with the focus of someone who had always had a mind for this and was not going to waste it now. Harlan's Creek was a real town, and a living one, and Mamie Merriweather Rourke had planted herself in it 25 years ago with a carpetbag and a promise to herself, and she had grown something here that was, in all its complicated and daily and deeply satisfying particulars, exactly what she had moved toward without knowing its precise shape. She had been sent back on 3 trains by 3 men who had found her unsuitable, and she had arrived in a 4th town and met a man who had looked at her with honest attention and said, without qualification or condition, that she should stay. And she had stayed, not because she was told to, not because someone had arranged it, but because this was the place where the gate matched the lock, where the person she was found the person she was supposed to be beside, and because on a Saturday morning in April of 1882 she had stepped off a train in Harlan's Creek, Texas, with $23 and a green wool dress and a stubbornness that turned out to be the most useful thing she owned. And a blacksmith had nearly walked into her on the main street with a piece of iron in his hand, and had then, over the course of one spring and one summer, with Emerson and coffee and deliberate steadiness, found a way to ask her to stay that she could not refuse. She had not refused, she was not sorry. The April morning deepened around them, and somewhere across town little Patrick Alfred was announcing his presence at full volume, and Thomas would be calming him with the patient ease of a father who was more like his mother than he knew, and William was studying in a room in Austin, and Eleanor was reading, and Mrs. Caldwell was making breakfast, and the live oak by the church was putting out its first new leaves of the season, pale and bright against the older wood. Alfred tightened his arm around her shoulders, and Mamie raised her coffee cup to no one in particular and drank it in the spring morning of a life well made, and the gate with MM in the ironwork was solid and real behind them, and the town of Harlan's Creek, Texas, went on about the business of being alive.